Good evening. I'm Rick Peters, president of the Boston Medical Library, and I'd like to welcome you to this hybrid presentation of our 21st annual Estes Lecture. The Boston Medical Library was refounded in 1875 by physicians including Dr. Henry Ingersoll Bowditch, an internist and public health pioneer, Dr. James Reed Chadwick, a gynecologist and the first BML librarian, and Dr. Oliver Wendell Holmes, the first president, to be a library to make current books and journals accessible to the practicing physicians and dentists. In 1889, Dr. Holmes donated his professional library to the BML. This library held both current and historic titles, including 2 books printed in the 1400s, which are called incunabula. Other collections came in over the years, and the BML still holds many of these titles, which are of interest to both health professionals and historians. J. Worth Estes was a professor of pharmacology at Boston University School of Medicine and an accomplished medical historian, serving as editor of the Journal of the History of Medicine and Allied Sciences, and writing several books and numerous articles. This lecture was established to honor his memory. I'd like to thank my colleagues on the Estes Selection Committee for their help in developing ideas for this lecture. Forgot to advance the slides. I would especially like to thank the committee chair, Dr. Di Maria, for his work in organizing this program. Dr. Di Maria will introduce tonight's speaker. Al?
Thank you, Rick. It is indeed a privilege to introduce speaker tonight, David Courtwright, who is Presidential Professor Emeritus at the University of North Florida. He received his undergraduate education at the University of Kansas and his Ph.D. in history at Rice University. He has taught American world and medical history. And tonight he's going to be talking about addiction, psychoactive substances, and more addiction in a broader sense than psychoactive substances. But while he's an authority in these areas, he's also published books on political history, violence in America, and history of aviation. He's the author of Dark Paradise, A History of Opiate Addiction in America, Addicts Who Survived, An Oral History of Narcotic Use in America, and Forces of Habit, Drugs in the Making of the Modern World. He has been featured extensively as a commentator in print, broadcast, and online media, including NPR, C-SPAN, and Smithsonian Magazine. His work has brought new historical insights into a critical area of public policy. His most recent book, The Age of Addiction, How Bad Habits Became Big Business, was published by Harvard's Belknap Press in 2019, and actually has been described as compulsively readable. His Estes selection this evening, Limbic Capitalism and Mass Addiction Before and After the Digital Revolution, summarizes and extends the arguments in the age of addiction. Dr. Courtwright.
Thank you, and thank you for that generous introduction. So, J. Worth Estes has already been mentioned, and I would like to add that one of the things that I always appreciated about him was the innovative quality of his research. He was a man of many talents. He was a psychologist, he was a physician, he was a historian, he was an editor. And even though I am going to be venturing beyond his familiar fields this evening, of history of medicine, history of pharmacy, I think he would have approved. He liked innovation, and I think he would have approved of the talk this evening, which I've written with him in mind. So where I'd like to begin is with the fact that since the 1980s, addictive behavior has become much more varied and much more commercialized. People used to, when you heard the word addiction, people would think of something like heroin addiction, no more. And in fact, since I published a global history of the expanding concept of addiction in 2019, The Age of Addiction, several other major books have come out on this theme. The difference is they tend to focus on the United States, whereas my perspective, both in the book and in this evening's lecture, is global. But Sam Quinones in The Least of Us, Anna Lemke, who is a Harvard psychiatrist in Dopamine Nation, and most recently, Jonathan Haidt in his book on the impact of mass media on younger generations. That book, you've probably seen reviews of that, and it's been widely reviewed. That's another deep dive into this phenomenon. So everybody seems to be catching on to this. And if I'm rubbernecking this evening, it's because my live audience is to one side and the people online are on the other side. So I'll get used to it. So anyway, addiction discourse used to be about psychoactive drugs, and now it's about alcohol and tobacco, and digitized gambling, and pornography, and compulsive overeating, and sugary drinks, and social media use, and computer games, and even habitual tanning. Did you know that there is a large referee medical literature on habitual tanning? Really, the field has grown enormously in the last 30 or 40 years. All right, so how do you organize this? I mean, writing a book, and Lord knows writing a global history is very much about organizing material. So how do you do this? And the way I did it is I tried to find a common thread, a kind of least common denominator, and that was limbic capitalism. And I defined limbic capitalism as basically a global business system in which entrepreneurs, often with the help of governments and sometimes even with the help of criminal organizations, encourage excessive consumption of an addiction to brain rewarding products. That would be a simple definition. So what you see on the screen is the face of limbic capitalism in 1969. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a professional gambler who is looking through a one-way mirror. This is what we had before we had cookies that tracked you. On the internet, we had one-way mirrors, and he's surveilling the audience, mostly tourists, waiting like sheep to be sheared on the floor of the gambling casino. But what he's looking out for, of course, are cheaters and card sharks. So he's kind of minding store in this image. But it occurred to me as I was putting this project together that if you substitute someone else for the gambler, if you think about Ray Kroc studying McDonald's customers in 1979, or if you think about Philip Morris executives studying Marlboro smokers in 1989, or if you think about Juul marketers looking at teenage vaping patterns in 2019, it's the same principle. They're targeting essentially a vulnerable audience. And what they're trying to do, of course, is to create and profit from consumer habits that provide quick hits of brain reward. And they basically grow their businesses by reinforcing and spreading those habits. That's it in a nutshell. So why limbic capitalism? Well, limbic, of course, refers to the brain region and associated pathways that are responsible for pleasure and motivation and long-term memory. And these are all features that are crucial for survival. I mean, your limbic system evolved for a reason. But the paradox is that commercial interests have figured out how to commandeer this system in ways that work against your survival. Right? The core problem here is loss of appetite control. And that's the fundamental problem with limbic capitalism, is that it undermines our appetite control. Now, these harms are often lethal. And even though The Age of Addiction is a work of global history, I did take one detour into formal epidemiology, and I worked through 2014 World Health Organization data. And to make a long story short, I discovered that there were 30 deaths for non-violence related causes. Violence being defined as either war or homicide. But if you looked at the kinds of deaths that came from smoking, overeating, or distracted driving, there were 30 premature deaths for every death due to homicide or war-related violence. By the way, the World Health Organization defines a premature death as one occurring before the age of 70. Now, another widely reported finding in the literature is that limbic capitalism's best customers, its dependent daily users, typically begin consuming potentially addictive products early in life. And that's why historically limbic capitalist advertising schemes have targeted the young. And that's also why public health authorities have wanted to impose age restrictions, like no sales of alcohol or tobacco to people who are under the age of 21, for example. And that's also why more recently critics like Haidt, Jonathan Haidt, whom I mentioned earlier, the social psychologist, have argued that we can and should hold social media giants accountable for failure to block underage use. Another way to think about this is that basically addictive behaviors, whether they're digital addictions or other forms of addiction, are basically types of pathological learning. They are the flip side of the coin of learning. If you think about learning, think about all the good things that we learn when we're young. We learn music, we learn language skills, we learn art, math. Well, we also learn bad habits, and you're especially susceptible to acquiring them. This is well known in the field of addiction medicine. The earlier you start consuming something like cannabis or some other psychoactive substance, the more likely you are to become a dependent daily user later in life. All right, so my goal was to find out how pathological learning became a business model and to trace the origins of limbic capitalism. I decided that what I really needed to do was to write a history of pleasure, vice, and addiction. These things were interconnected in fundamental ways. An addiction is typically a subset of a vice, and a vice is a subset of pleasures, or even contested pleasures. You'll see in this image, I've got actually 4 circles. If you think about it, these categories kind of bleed into one another, and there are things that used to be considered simple pleasures, like sugar, which has, in the last 20 or 30 years, moved into the realm of a contested pleasure. And there used to be things that we called vices, like cannabis smoking, which now are moving into the realm of contested pleasures. This is not the case. And so these things they're socially constructed categories to some degree. But even allowing for that element of social construction, addiction is a subset of vice, vice is a subset of pleasure. And in fact, one of the reasons we call something a vice is that it is especially likely to lead to an addiction. And indeed, the greater an activity's addictive potential, the more likely we are to say, okay, pin the label of vice on that. Another way to say this is that addiction is a vice that has become unusually strong, unusually preoccupying, and unusually harmful. Addiction is at the end, or I guess in the case of this slide, at the bottom of a spectrum of habitual excessive consumption that causes personal and social harms. All right, so what determines this? Most important factor, at least in my research, is technological and business innovation. These innovations have largely determined the variety of pleasures, vices, and addictions. And the important thing to understand here is that when pleasures multiply, so do the subsets of vices and addictions. That's an important message. You can't have more of one without having more of the other. It's unfortunate, but that's the way it is. And you know, anything that expands this big outer balloon of pleasure, whether it's technological or whether it's, you know, it's an improvement in the distribution of some brain rewarding product or it's marketing innovation, whatever it is, anything that expands the universe of pleasures is inevitably going to expand the parallel universes or the subsets of contested pleasures, vices, and addictions. All right, so this is a schematic. This is merely a heuristic device. But let me show you what the argument looks like in outline form in the book. And it's basically, for most of history, our expansion of the universe of pleasure was serendipitous. People would discover things like the reinforcing properties of nicotine. And then you'd have the Columbian exchange and Europeans would discover the joys of smoking and so on. And it was a kind of accidental helter-skelter process. But the pace of this expansion of the universe of pleasures accelerated in the 17th and 18th centuries with transoceanic commerce. And then it quickened again in the 19th and 20th centuries with the Industrial Revolution. And what happened, interestingly, at the end of the late 19th and the early 20th centuries is that reformers, both secular and religious reformers, awoke to the threat that was being posed by this industrialization of potentially addictive substances and behaviors, and they counterattacked. This was the age of transnational anti-vice activism. And here you see an example on this slide of one such effort, which was an international conference against alcoholism, which was held at The Hague in 1911. But ultimately, pro-vice interests won. They were able to turn back the reform tide. They were able to, for example, reverse the global prohibition efforts of the early 20th century. We tend to think of prohibition as something that happened in the United States, but in fact, more than 20 nations around the world passed or enacted some form of beverage alcohol prohibition, and those were basically all gone by the mid-1930s. So Limbic capitalists won the political contest, they won the technological arms race, they created blended hedonic environments and products that multiplied occasions for what we would technically call the burst release of dopamine. And I guess the main thing I want you to take away from this evening's event is that even though we live in an age where there's a lot of talk about smartphones and social media and now generative AI, they're really part of a much larger and deeper historical process. Technology has been expanding the addictive potential of certain consumer goods and pastimes for a long time. And now we've really put our foot down on the accelerator, as you'll see in just a minute. All right, so anyway, what I want to do this evening is just give you some examples from 3 of the book's chapters. That's all I'll have time for, because I want to leave some time for discussion at the end. So I'll just concentrate on the 3 highlighted chapters here. And I'll start off by showing you a very famous painting. This is Paul Cézanne's The Card Players. I can tell from the last in the audience that there are moments of recognition here. This is in the Barnes collection in Philadelphia, or I should say this one is in the Barnes collection because he returned to this theme again and again. He painted several similar canvases. This one happens to be in the Barnes collection. And it's a great example of what historians call the confluence, flowing together of the world's psychoactive resources. So whether you're here in the room or you're looking at this on your screen, when you first look at this image, you see what seems to be a quintessentially French setting. In fact, these people who posed for this were workers on Cézanne's father's estate in Aix in France. And what could be more French than this setting? And yet, if we do the historian's equivalent of an MRI and we kind of zoom in on this, we look at this more carefully, we start to notice things that they're playing cards. Now, where do cards come from? cards come originally from Korea and China. And then they made their way to Europe, and Europeans developed their own card games in early modern and modern. Now they appear to be playing cards. Do you see the checkered pattern underneath the cards? They appear to be playing on a backgammon board. Where does backgammon come from? It comes from an ancient race game that was first played in Mesopotamia. And then we've inherited the modern version, which is backgammon. The tobacco it's used in the pipes that they're either smoking or you see on the rack on the wall back there came originally from the Americas. Even the contents of the olive jar, if you look very carefully at this, you'll see a green jar in the upper left-hand corner of the painting. That contains olives, and olives came originally from Asia Minor. Even though, of course, because all the propaganda the art museums has thrown at us for decades, we tend to think of olive trees. Oh, that's south of France. Well, sure, it is, but if you look at the origins, those plants, those trees originated somewhere else. Art historians have spilled a lot of ink in the debate over the expressions on the card players' faces, what's going through their minds. And I have a very simple non-art historian explanation, which is they're concentrating because they're gambling. so that's I think there's some stake, significant stake to this game. So again, look at the playing cards. How were those made? Originally, they were made by hand, but by the time this painting came into existence over a period of what, 3 years, 1890 to 1892, they were being made by steam presses. All right, and that's true pleasures and pastimes generally. One of the big things that happens in the 19th century is the industrialization and therefore the democratization of pleasure. So here we have a cigar making machine. This is from a patent drawing from the British Patent Office, 1859. So the processed leaves are sent down a conveyor belt, and cheap labor, in this case, cheap female labor, turns out finished product, which is basically cheap cigars. Now, fast forward from 1859 to 1881, and an American inventor named James Bonsack comes up with a machine that will spit out 200 cigarettes per minute with flue-cured tobacco. And he makes a lot of money, and the American cigarette industry takes off. What's really interesting to me is if you follow up the history of this invention, you learn that by 1930, there were similar machines that were spitting out 1,800 cigarettes per minute, which is a 9-fold increase in productivity in about half a century. So this story happens again and again and again. Whether we're talking about something like slot machines or pari-mutuel betting or risque movies or candy bars or ice cream, what the political scientist Jonathan Calkins calls temptation goods. Regardless of the product we're talking about, all of them become cheaper and more widely available, with health consequences for both individuals and for public health. All right, so while we're on the subject of food, and before skipping ahead to digital addictions, I just wanted to make one quick point about food. I know several of the people here are interested in the subject of food addiction. It's really gained quite the high profile in recent years. And one of the reasons for that is the work of Dr. Nora Volkow. Now, Dr. Volkow, I see 9 heads in the room. Dr. Nora Volkow is the director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse. Why is it that they had NIDA, National Institute on Drug Abuse? Why had she been one of the ones spearheading growing awareness of food addiction? Okay, and the reason for that is because, under the new conception of addiction, hyperpalatable food is increasingly seen as a psychoactive drug or having effects similar to psychoactive drugs. You know, how do we know this? Well, you can do what Dr. Volkoff does. You can look at imaging studies of, say, morbidly obese patients and people who have become addicted to cocaine and various other drugs. And sure enough, you see the same kinds of patterns, such as a downregulation in dopamine D2 receptors. So Volkoff calls this, by the way, just to quote her briefly, she calls this the biological signature of a brain where the capacity to control strong urges has been compromised. And which is exactly what I was saying earlier. I mean, that is the basic problem with limbic capitalism, is that it undermines appetite control. I don't have time to play it this evening, but if you're interested in more, you can go to Dr. Volkoff's excellent TED-Med talk, which is available online. And you'll be struck, as I was when I first listened to her talk, about how much of it was about food and in comparison to the traditional subjects of alcohol and other psychoactive drugs. Now, so why is she doing this? I think one of the reasons for this is that Dr. Volkoff and her brain disease model of addiction allies are after really big game. They are seeking a psychological and biological, more generally, a scientific explanation of pathological learning across a range of behaviors that the NIH has long identified as major risk factors for chronic illness and early death. So, you know, one of the reasons you do drug research is going to keep people from becoming ill and dying prematurely. Same point about food and other kinds of behaviors. It's all basically in the same bucket. All right, which brings us to smartphones and social media. Oh, here, this is an illustration of the big game principle. Is, you know, why do we care about this? Because we know that so many diseases are linked to obesity and other food-related illnesses. All right, so that brings us to smartphones and social media. Their heavy compulsive use entails a range of harms, from elevated risk of car crashes to insomnia. Juvenile users in particular can become enmeshed in a virtual world of perpetual distraction, celebrity idolatry, malicious gossip, cyberbullying, desensitization, anxiety, pornographic sex, and intellectual stultification. So, you know, real Rembrandt is better than fake Facebook, or at least one can plausibly argue. Why do people become so absorbed in social media platforms and computer games? The incentives and the disincentives for quitting go beyond simple brain reward. This is not just about the burst release of dopamine. There are other social factors that go into this. In the case of social media and games, there are goals that you want to achieve. Variable reinforcement schedule is very powerful. There's a sense of progress. There's certain scenarios you don't want to leave. You want to see how the poker hand plays out, or how the role-playing game ends. And also, interestingly, peers will bring pressure to bear on you. You can't just quit. Jonathan Alter, who wrote a very good book on the subject back in 2017, refers to this as the rewards and punishments of your digital tribe. So these are the big six, according to Alter. Now, two other things that we know about heavy internet use are that, first, it's concentrated among the young, and second, that it's continuing to increase. So the Pew Research Center did two surveys, one back in 2014, 2015, and another one more recently in 2022. I've taken their data sets and I've combined them in my own graphic, but I just want to acknowledge that this is Pew data. And what you can see is big increase just in what, 8 years between 2014, 2015, and 2022. Huge increase from almost constant internet use rising from 24% during the first time period to 46% by 2022. Again, this is among young. During the same interval, and not coincidentally, the percentage of US teens having access to a smartphone rose from 73 to 95%. Among 13 to 14-year-olds, more than 9 in 10 had access. Among 15 to 17-year-olds, 49 out of 50 had access. So this has become a truly ubiquitous technology. Now, in honor of the setting, teenagers are not the only vulnerable population. One of the more interesting, not to say counterintuitive findings in the literature is that medical students are at particularly high risk. I say counterintuitive because our image of a medical student is somebody who kept his or her nose clean in high school, studied really hard, and did well on the exams. Well, I'm sorry to disillusion you, but a 2017 meta-analysis of studies of internet addiction, as measured by a validated questionnaire, actually 2 validated questionnaires. Now, found a pooled prevalence of 30% for some 3,600 undergraduate medical students in 6 different countries. Okay, so this is an international meta-analysis, and that's approximately 5 times the rate for the general population. Okay, the 30% figure. And things may be getting worse, because after I came across this meta-analysis, I came across a recent study of undergraduate medical students in Ethiopia, of all places, and 79% of those students had at least mild or moderate internet addiction. I'm tempted to give you the hypotheses for this now, but I think it might be more fun to ask you to try to figure this out on your own, and maybe we'll come back to this later and see what people come up with by way of explanation. Now, the internet and its linked devices have also simplified access to new vices like AI-generated pornography, as well as old vices like illicit drugs, which are available, as I think everybody knows, through social media and e-commerce platforms. That includes counterfeit drugs containing increasing amounts of cheap fentanyl. The DEA laboratory reports that 7 in 10 fentanyl-laced prescription pills that the lab analyzed in 2023 contain a potentially lethal dose. The DEA defines a potentially lethal dose as 2 milligrams or more of fentanyl per tablet. That's up from 4 tablets containing similar dose in 2021, which is a 75% increase in 2 years. Where does this fentanyl come from? Well, it mainly comes from Mexican traffickers who use encrypted messaging platforms to bulk order precursor chemicals from accommodating Chinese manufacturers. The manufacturers signal buyers with web ads such as Mexican stock or 100% past customs. So you don't have to be a genius to figure what kind of a product is on offer. And interestingly, the Chinese manufacturers take their pay in cryptocurrency, which is yet another internet innovation, I should say digital innovation, that has facilitated illicit limbic capitalism. Moreover, it's not the only new wrinkle in the story. Pew found that since 2015, young users have shifted away from Facebook towards Snapchat, Instagram, and TikTok. And all 3 of those platforms provide easy, or in the case of TikTok, algorithmically guided access to illicit drugs and drug paraphernalia, as well as to pornography. Images of drunkenness and drinking games are also popular on social media, which brings me to another aspect of pathological learning, modeling behavior. Alcohol intoxicates, but as medical anthropologists have long observed, how you behave while you're intoxicated is learned in specific social and cultural contexts. And you know, one of those contexts is social media, and there one encounters, particularly among posts of the young, images of chugging from a can or bottle, or sometimes two cans or bottles, toilet hugging, people passed out at parties, and so on. And this is how people learn to behave when they drink alcohol or consider food. In 2009, mukbang, a Korean word meaning eat broadcast, it's a portmanteau word for eat broadcast, became part of the webcasting repertoire. Mukbang garnered millions of followers and thousands of dollars in revenue for young, cute, pattering, often impossibly slim broadcasting jockeys who streamed food porn, eating large plates of delicious food while chattering to your audience. And you'll notice the thinness of these webcasters. That's due to another internet phenomenon, the ubiquity of bulimic videos with titles like "How to Purge" and "Downsize Your Wardrobe." I'm just going to skip over this. You know that there's a counter argument, which is that the web is a great thing, which can bring you access to the world's medical literature, Maria Callas arias, webcasting, whatever. There's another side to the internet, and that's obviously true, but empirically, the key question is one of the relative traffic in learning related searches. And here it is, I'm gonna skip this as well. No, let me back up, excuse me. Yes, I'm just going to share some data with you. I don't have this as a slide, but you need to know that every survey since 2007 has shown that by far the largest number of searches, especially searches by young people, involve activities like sex. And you know, a lot of these are just simple curiosity. One of the leading searches in, believe it or not, in the year 2000, the first year of the smartphone, one of the leading searches was how to make out. There was a Google string, how to make out. And so there's a lot of kind of curiosity about these behaviors. But it's not all just kind of innocent curiosity. And now, just to briefly cite some very recent studies, 4 of the top 20 Google searches involve pornography or related sites. And that's very recent data. That's 2024 data. Pornhub at number 3 trailed only YouTube and Facebook. It nosed out weather, and even Amazon finishes behind Pornhub in volume of searches. So, and I did some investigation of my own, and trust me, How to Grow Cannabis will produce way more hits than Maria Callas. That's what the problem is. All right, so now back to Dr. Volkoff. So is there any good news about teens and digital addictions? Yes, sort of. Volkoff has pointed out that there is or has been a long-term decline, which you see here, in alcohol and cannabis use among US teens. If you compare 2 periods, 1979, which was the height of the youthful cannabis use in the United States, and 2023, there has been a decline. That's the good news. But Volkoff makes 2 points, which are very interesting. One is, one likely reason for this is that young people no longer interact in the same physical space. So if you're talking to somebody on your smartphone and that somebody is 3 blocks away, you're not going to pass them the bottle, pass them the joint. Right? So that's part of it. The other, and it's kind of scarier part of this, when Volkoff was asked, well, are teens substituting one form of neurochemical stimulation for another? She said, yes, there is evidence of substitutability. So if you're getting your little burst of dopamine from digital technology, you may not need, in some sense, to turn to these other more traditional means of acquiring the same thing. Here's another takeaway from this evening's talk. We don't know the answer to an important question, which is more dangerous for young people, to be exposed to alcohol and other psychoactive substances and to use those more, or to be immersed in this expanding digital universe and to be, depending on those pastimes, for brain reward. Long term, which of those is more harmful? We don't know the answer to that question, but what we do know is that we are in the midst of a gigantic natural experiment on an entire generation, and that experiment is in fact worldwide. It's not just in the United States. I have some other piece of good news. I'll just conclude with this. There's no reason to despair, because history also shows us that it is possible to reduce, not stop in its tracks, but to reduce some forms of harm caused by limbic capitalism. Best example of that, of course, is the successful global campaign against combustible tobacco products, which for a long time was treading water, but in the last 20 or 30 years has really taken off and enjoyed significant success. One of the reasons it did so was ridicule. Ridicule, such as the defacing of billboards, was an important tactic used in countries like, in this case, Australia, to mock the kings of tobacco, and with ultimately important legislative results in Australia and other countries. I think I'll end with the words of the man that you see in this photograph. His name is Dr. Arthur Chesterfield Evans. He's a part of an organization called Bug Up, which defaced tobacco billboards in Australia. He's a surgeon, and this is what he had to say. And these words really came home to me when I was doing the research for this book. He said, after 6 years of surgery, I could accept that people had to suffer and die. But I had real trouble coming to terms with the fact that cigarette diseases were the result of a cold-blooded and systematic deception waged by moneyed interests against less informed consumers. They climbed the ladder, rattled his can, and he spray painted on the sign, "Legal drug pushers, the real criminals." The cheering, placard-waving crowd joined in, covering the ad from top to bottom with mocking graffiti. Interestingly, the police, who were looking on, did nothing to stop. All this happened in 1983. We live still in a world in which moneyed interests wage cold-blooded and systematic campaigns of deception against less informed consumers, and for that matter, against better informed consumers as well. Except the campaign has been digitally weaponized in ways that Dr. Chesterfield Evans could not have imagined more than 4 decades ago, back in 1983. I thank you for your attention. I acknowledge help from these institutions, and I have been told to remind you that if you have questions, you are permitted to enter them through the chat. Thank you very much.
If you have a question in the room, the mics will pick up on you, so you can just ask it. We'll Zoom on for your questions.
I have a question. David, one of the characteristics of addiction is that when the addicting substance is withdrawn, there are consequences to the individual that causes them to need the return of the substance. And if the addicting substance is not, it's not a pharmacologic substance, but digital or gambling or whatever. Yeah, I never thought about this before. What are the consequences of withdrawal? What's the evidence for those consequences?
Would you mind summarizing that? real
Yeah,
quick?
no, so the question is, if people have a behavioral addiction, digital or otherwise, do they experience withdrawal symptoms that are analogous to those that someone who is addicted to a psychoactive substance like cocaine or an opioid would have? And the answer is yes, although the withdrawal symptoms take a different form. There are a few, mostly anecdotal accounts of fairly severe physical symptoms manifest by people who were, say, thoroughly addicted to gaming, who are sweating and restless and so on. When they finally, their spouse typically says, I'm leaving you, or their employer says, I'm going to fire you if you don't quit spending all your time online. There have been reports of physical symptoms, but I think the more serious problem would be in the realm of psychological symptoms, things like anhedonia or heightened depression or anxiety, not necessarily the kinds of physical symptoms that you would see for somebody who is, say, physiologically dependent on opioids.
There's one question online too, I can get to. They're asking if you can comment on addictions of excitability versus calming, such as gambling, racing, adrenaline, like drugs versus THC, smoking, Brave New World, so on. If people seek out one type as a form of substitution of a chemical deficit, is it the overshoot that is compensated by use of the other category? Or is brain dysfunction in general the cause of multiple addictions, the potential gateway to more potent substitutes? There's one more follow-up question, but I'll give you a chance to answer that.
Okay. There are about 5 questions in that first. So let me give this answer and we'll see if it's adequate. People are actually seeking different things in a sense, especially if we're talking about psychiatric comorbidity. So I mean, this is another element we need to introduce into the conversation, is all of these things are rewarding in some sense in a normal brain, but they're even more rewarding if people have, say, anxiety or depression. And so virtually every study of behavioral addictions has shown that people, there are different patterns. So I'll use the concrete example of gambling. So there's a book called Addiction by Design, which is a study of digitized gambling in Las Vegas, which is quite a good study. And you may be surprised to learn that the majority of people who are lost, if it's not an absolute majority, it's a very substantial percentage of the people who are just lose themselves in video poker or in digitized bingo games or slots or whatever, are women. And they are escape gamblers. They are people who have told ethnographers that what they're trying to do by spending hour after hour after hour playing these digitized gambling games in a casino is to escape into this world. All right. Now, there are other kinds of compulsive gamblers, and the late John McCain, who loved craps tables in Vegas, just throwing the dice, and the kind of person who's blowing on the dice and says, come on, baby, I need an 11. That person is an action, and what they're looking for is the rush that comes, not necessarily the zoning out, but they're looking for the rush. Now, I don't know if anyone's ever done this study. I can't tell you what the relative proportions are, but I can tell you that there are definitely different effects, and people are definitely looking for those effects when they enter into a particular gaming environment. And I know enough about the literature on psychiatric comorbidity to understand that there would certainly be that the drug or behavior would be solving different problems for different individuals, depending on what the comorbidity was. Okay, and then would you say there was a follow-up?
The last question was how can we use the answer for successful prolonged treatment?
Can you repeat that question?
How can we use the answer for successful prolonged treatment? So the answer of the question I'm trying to start with.
Well, let me just address the question of successful long-term treatment. That also is very drug specific and very very person specific, very patient specific, if you want to put it that way. We're talking about opioids. It's clear that the greatest likelihood of saving someone's life and eventually returning function and reuniting them with their family and making them more productive and all of that is through medication assisted treatment. Now I'm generalizing about the population. There are going to be exceptions, and this is one of the things that makes this so difficult. There are people who truly have hit rock bottom and they have a social support network and set of motivations, including possibly religious beliefs, that means that some kind of abstinence-oriented therapy is actually going to work better for them. There are always exceptions, but as a public health generality, we know that medication-assisted treatment works best for a condition like opioid addiction. Interestingly, we know that naltrexone is one of the treatments that works across addictions, whether it's food addiction or whether it's gambling addiction or whether we're talking about something like opioid addiction. Antagonists tend to block the receptors that are involved in the addictive processes, and so yeah, but the problem there is motivating people to take them on a regular basis, and some people are better with that treatment. And some people are just going to resist and run away as fast as they can. So you can generalize. Actually, I was about to say you can't generalize, but there is one generalization that does appear in the historical evidence. I just thought of this. But for any given drug or behavior, there's a treatment war. So in the field of food addiction, for example, there are clones of Alcoholics Anonymous. They're even called for example, Food Addicts Anonymous, which follow the 12-step model. And they think that any other approach is just wrong. And yet there are other approaches. And you can see that kind of divide and that kind of civil warfare among various treatment modalities in just about any branch of addiction treatment you care to name. And that in itself, I think, is good evidence of the fact that it's not one size fits all, that some people do better with different treatments than others. And then, of course, the people who run treatment programs think that what worked for them is the best, and that's the thing that's going to work for everybody else. So there's a kind of projection of subjective experience that intensifies this very sometimes personal warfare that one observes in these different fragmented treatment communities.
There's another question online, but if someone in the room wants to ask one, I can go back and forth. Online? All right. So someone's asking, have activities such as fan fiction or cosplaying been researched or considered addictive behaviors? Like writing fan fiction or cosplaying?
Yeah, that's a variation of a question I'm often asked, which is, are there constructive or positive addictions? And the answer to that is yes, but they're not called addictions. They're usually called flow states. And there can be certain activities that one indulges in very regularly, in fact, so regularly that maybe other things don't get done, but on balance, they're you're better off because of those pastimes. You enjoy life more, you know, you're better at solving that crossword puzzle because you're in the, right, one way. But if on balance, more good comes out of it than harm, then by definition, it can't be an addiction. Because if you look at any version of the DSM you care to name, you're going to see that one aspect of the, whether it's called an addiction or a substance use disorder or whatever it's called, you're going to see that one aspect of it is harm to self and others. So individual health harms, public health consequences. If those aren't there, then yes, it may be a behavior on which you spend a lot of time. And in fact, necessarily so. If you ask the question, how do you become a professional musician? One answer is you're on average going to spend about 10,000 hours of intense practice before you get to the point where you're really a professional. And you know, there went with you. But would we want to call that an addiction? No, I think that's I think that would be an abuse of the term.
More questions online right now.
Thank you, Dr. Courtwright. And thank you all for attending.